The tragic life of Jonathan Joestar, a true gentleman and the first ever JoJo. When it comes to character design, one look at Jonathan would bring you to awe at exactly how tall and stacked he was as a person. When it comes to describing his personality, only one word could have the power to do so, and that is gentleman. Jonathan would go ahead and turn out to be the protagonist of the first part of the series, named Phantom Blood. As the whole story takes place in England, rest assured that almost every single set piece you will see throughout this journey will be classic Victorian. Jonathan was born as the son of George and Mary Joestar in 1868. However, Jonathan was unfortunate as his mother tragically passed away when he was just a child. Of course, what Jonathan did not know was that the incident where his mother passed away will end up being the defining factor for the rest of his life, as well as all descendants of the Joestar family that will come after him. Let's take a look at Jonathan's father, George Joestar. George Joestar is considered to be a highly sought-after businessman and merchant with wealth that many would dream to have. After all, he managed to purchase an entire estate for his family to live on. It is safe to say that when it comes to finances, the Joestar family was set for life. Jonathan was essentially a rich English nobility, which suited the personality that Jonathan strived to obtain ever since childhood. Of course, Jonathan was not serious all the time, as he did have a mischievous side as many people his age would, but he always kept his outbursts tasteful and in a pleasant manner. After all, everything that he did was centralized around his ideology of becoming a true gentleman. Other than his father, there are two other important figures that Jonathan had during his years growing up, and one was the pet that he considered his best friend, a cheerful Great Dane named Danny. It is safe to say that the two did not connect right away, as Danny was generally timid, as he was afraid of spaces that he was unfamiliar with. This caused Danny to bite Jonathan at times, which caused Jonathan to even throw rocks at him at times. However, the rocky relationship soon solidified when Danny heroically saved Jonathan from drowning. This essentially caused Jonathan and Danny to practically become inseparable. The other important figure is none other than Irina Pendleton, a girl who Jonathan essentially fancied when he was young. He even went as far as getting beat up by two bullies for her when he intervened to save Irina from them. Of course, while many would consider the act to be needlessly selfless, regardless of that, this was the act that caused Irina to feel for him, as it eventually grew to the point where the two became boyfriend and girlfriend. Of course, everything that came into Jonathan's life this point out takes a completely different turn. No series would be as exciting if not for rivalries and conflict, right? Well, in this particular series, rivalries and conflict are more of an understatement. It is safe to say that Jonathan's life turned upside down in the worst way possible after the appearance of one Dio Brando. Early life, 1868 to 1881. Now that we have taken a general look at Jonathan Young's character, and where else to begin than where it all began? The incident where Mary Joestar met her tragic end. On the night of the carriage accident, another man named Dio Brando was present. He happened to discover the crashed carriage of the Joestar family, as the first thing that he attempted to do was to look at the carriage and their corpses. Of course, being a person who always saw good, Jonathan's father, George Joestar, identified Dario as someone who was trying to rescue the survivors of the crash. Of course, later on in life, George would realize that not all is as white as it seemed when it comes to Dario's personalities and actions. He would still maintain a sense of debt towards Dario for his supposed attempts of rescue at that fateful night. Of course, this feeling of debt is the reason why George accepted Dario's son into his own family after Dario's mysterious death. That son was none other than Dio Brando, the boy that managed to turn Jonathan's entire life into a living nightmare. Ever since he first stepped his foot into the Joestar estate, how did he manage such a feat? The heartless Dio went ahead and murdered Danny by shoving him into an incinerator and forcefully kissed Irina in order to cause a rift between her and Jonathan. This eventually leads up to Irina moving to India with her father as well, leaving the situation truly dire for Jonathan. Phantom Blood, 1888. This, along with the fact that George was an unforgivingly harsh father, left Jonathan in a position of loneliness and dismay. This lifestyle continues on for Jonathan for 8 whole years, as Jonathan would always keep an eye on Dio, while also maintaining a gentlemanly personality. Of course, Jonathan's patience was running thin when he discovers Dio's plot of slowly poisoning his weak father, George Joestar, in order to steal the Joestar family fortune all for himself. This causes Jonathan to set out in search of an antidote, as well as evidence that could prove Dio's actions and incriminate him. Before he left, however, he ensured his father's safety by only allowing his closest trusted physicians to take care of him. Jonathan's search would lead him to Ogre Street, where he has a confrontation with a notorious street thug named Robert E.O. Speedwagon. Of course, course, England being England, you can always expect thug and street names to be the most bizarre out there. The meetup between Joestar and Speedwagon end up being an important event in Jonathan's life, as the conflict causes Speedwagon to realize what sort of man Jonathan was. After all, by the time of this conflict, Jonathan was a strong man with sharp intelligence. He had enough physical prowess to fight off his minions and even kill Speedwagon if he felt like it. Of course, as we covered before, the core principle that runs in all of Jonathan's thoughts, urges and principles are to be a proper gentleman, and that alone caused Jonathan to be kind towards the very people he was facing in this conflict. Of course, this caused Speedwagon to start respecting him immediately. In Speedwagon's own words, he's not just looks and clothes, but a real honest to good gentleman. I like it. This conflict ended with Jonathan winning an ally as well as a trusted friend. After the whole conflict came to pass, Speedwagon helped Jonathan find what he needed, as Jonathan finally managed to find the antidote that his father needed to survive. Of course, Jonathan and Speedwagon also conferred to George of Dio's true plan and prepared to have Dio arrested. Of course, this did not end well. Birth of a vampire. What Jonathan did not know was the fact that the stone mask has been in the mind of Dio for a while now, and during his absence, while looking for the antidote, Dio had managed to unlock the secret of the stone mask. The stone mask had the power to cast away one's humanity, as it would then give them life as a form of an immortal vampire. Of course, in order to obtain power that was beyond human limitations, Dio used the stone mask in order to become a strong vampire that could face a barrage of bullets and still stand up as if nothing happened. Of course, the hardest loss for Jonathan in the conflict that ensued is the loss of his father, George, as he sacrificed himself to save Jonathan from Dio. This was another instance where Dio took away something so paramount in Jonathan's life away from him. This is where Jonathan finally steeled himself to deal with what was in front of him that had the face of Dio. After all, he knew that even if it was Dio, he was no longer human. In order to make this happen, however, Jonathan had to set the entire mansion on fire in order to secure the kill by counteracting Dio's insane healing abilities through the burning. This ends up working out as Dio found himself impaled by a statue in the estate as the entire building burnt down and was considered for all intents and purposes to be dead. However, as many other supervillains do, Dio eventually revealed himself to be alive. However, Jonathan felt as if a ray of sunshine had entered his life after so long when he finally regained consciousness after the conflict, as he woke up being nursed by the one woman that he had ever loved, Irina Pendleton. It had been 7 years since the two saw each other, and the two made sure to use the opportunity to reconnect after so long. Ripple training. Of course, from here on out, the series decides to stay true to its name, as Jonathan's story takes an absolutely bizarre turn. After Jonathan was all healed up and discharged from the hospital, he meets Will Anthonio Zeppeli, who was a mysterious Italian martial artist who ended up revealing the fact that Dio is in fact not dead, and introduced him to an art named Hammond, also known as Ripple. This ended up being an integral skill for Jonathan to learn in order to face Dio in equal footing and defeat him once and for all. Needless to say, but Zeppeli's mysterious nature was something that was different from the other bizarre moments he has with other companions, but eventually, Jonathan and Zeppeli ended up trusting and respecting one another to the point where Zeppeli ends up being an important mentor figure to Jonathan as well as a good friend. Of course, his style of training was quite unusual, as he would make Jonathan do all sorts of strange things in his training to master the art of Hammond. How strange are we talking? How about fighting off a zombie version of Jack the Ripper while holding a full wine glass on one hand without spilling a single drop? Zeppeli is one of those characters that made JoJo's adventure pretty bizarre in its own right, that's for sure. Luck and pluck. Eventually, Jonathan and Zeppeli end up facing all sorts of perils, as it all led up to them both finally facing a more powerful state of vampire Dio. Of course, as all conflicts between Jonathan and Dio have been so far, it did not end very well. In the fights that Jonathan had to be in, Jonathan was showing off the fruits of his training, as he showed a lot of promise in the arts that he was trained in. Jonathan used the art of Hammond in order to defeat the zombified 16th century knight named Bruford, who happened to be one of Dio's strongest zombie warriors. However, after the conflict between Jonathan and Bruford ended, Bruford finally regained his humanity back, as he ended up respecting Jonathan for the man that he is. The respect was at a level where Bruford entrusted his sword to Jonathan. The exchange was an iconic moment within the series, which many did not understand the true meaning of, as it requires some knowledge of 19th century English literature. The concept of luck and pluck is something that existed within literature for quite some time, and both sides represent Dio and Jonathan's characters perfectly. Luck is the perfect representation of Dio, as his father Dario's attempt to rob George's carriage would eventually provide him of the easy path through murder and deceit in order to obtain riches. Meanwhile, Pluck ends up being the perfect representation of Jonathan, as he had to succeed through all sorts of hardships and trials that tested his will and determination, even with all of his family, loved ones, and even wealth plucked away from him. Again, while it was a moment that required insight in order to understand, it only goes to show how well written the storyline really is. Of course, this did not mark the end of the conflict, and the subsequent tragedy that followed would be something that will hit Jonathan Joestar hard. In the battle against the other zombie warrior named Tarkus, Zeppeli ended up putting his life on the line by sacrificing himself in order to save Jonathan. However, Zeppeli also went ahead and transferred all of his Hammond into Jonathan, which helped him immensely in the process of obtaining the power needed to defeat Tarkus. Of course, when the dust cleared, the cause of it was clear, and it was the death of another dear figure of Jonathan's life, the final battle. However, now the path was clear for Jonathan to look for a final confrontation with Dio. After all, Dio had been a bane in his life ever since his arrival, giving him trouble while also causing the loss of the people around him that he holds dear. After a surprisingly calculated battle, Jonathan manages to best Dio as he finishes him off with a Hammond-infused punch, which sends Dio's body flying off a balcony as he disintegrated. Of course, as it usually always happens, this was not the last time Jonathan saw Dio. Marriage in conclusion. After the conflict had passed, Jonathan ensured that the stone mask was destroyed to ensure that its evil power will not be used by anyone ever again. Jonathan's life takes a happy turn as 2 weeks after the conflict, Jonathan gets married to the love of his life, Erina. Imagine being able to put together a whole wedding in the matter of 2 weeks. Truly bizarre. Like the name would suggest, am I right? In order to celebrate the happy union, Jonathan and Erina Joestar boarded a ship embarked on a journey to America to celebrate their honeymoon. Of course, in true Dio fashion, he had a plan to ruin everything, this time being there in the form of a talking severed head. Definitely not what you want to see right after the day of your wedding, eh? Dio's grand plan was to take over Jonathan's body all for himself. Of course, not backing down, Jonathan decides to end this once and for all by setting his Hammond powers in order to cause an explosion on the ship that will sink them deep in the waters. Of course, Jonathan ensured the safety of his wife and their son by placing her in the blast-proof coffin that Dio initially hit before setting off the explosion. This would bring about the end of Jonathan Joestar as he died, holding Dio's head in his arms tightly as he died before the ship even sank. Dio ended up taking over Jonathan's body as he mysteriously escaped the sinking of the ship as well. However, not all is tragic, as Jonathan's lineage lived on through the child that Erina Joestar had in her womb, who would eventually grow up to be George Joestar II. In the end, Jonathan lived up to everything that he ever strived to be, a true gentleman who is ferocious when the time calls for it. Jonathan Joestar shows us exactly how unique the core principles of the main character can be, and he does so in style. While Jonathan only holds the mantle of the main protagonist within the first season of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, he still manages to make it unforgettable through his actions.